I was petrified.
We were just firing nonstop.
And I fired that 50 caliber till the barrel melted.
I'll tell you, it scares you today to think about it. Wonder how come we could all come back.
Over 50 years ago, these men shared incredible experiences. At this reunion in St. George, Utah, the men talked about how they owe their lives to each other and to their faith. In June 1950, just 5 years after the end of World War II, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. South Korea attempted to repel them. Immediately, the UN called for North Korea's withdrawal. Within days, South Koreans abandoned Seoul, and President Truman ordered U.S. forces to help.
In these circumstances, the United Nations, if it is to be an effective instrument for keeping the peace, has no choice except to use the collective strength of its members to curb aggression.
With other UN countries, American forces fought back across the 38th parallel. North Korea's neighbor, China, was waiting. Feeling threatened, China moved thousands of troops south across the Korean border and began its offensive. America felt it was in a global fight against communism.
Korea is not only a country undergoing the torment of aggression, it is also a symbol. It stands for right and justice in the world against aggression, oppression, and slavery.
During all these international events, Southern Utahns prepared in their own way. On August 3, 1950, the Southern Utah National Guard 213th Field Artillery Battalion was activated to full service. The men were ready. A corps of National Guardsmen had been training twice a month and also during their annual 2-week training at Camp Williams. Additional men enlisted with the 213th so they could stay close to family and friends and avoid being drafted into an unfamiliar unit. Over 500 Southern Utahns responded to the call. Most were not hardened soldiers. They were businessmen, college students, farmers, and newlyweds that made up the 5 batteries from the small towns of Richfield, Fillmore, Beaver, Cedar City, and St. George. Some were turned away for being too young. Some of the leaders were battle-tested vets from World War II. The enthusiastic response was not unusual from commitments built on a strong foundation of religion, family, and work. Most of the men came from Mormon families with a rich history of serving their country. The 213th Battalion itself had a long military heritage, beginning with the Nauvoo Legion, the Mormon Battalion, the Civil War, and both World Wars. It was expected that these men would serve.
We just felt like we were there to perform a duty, and if we done what we should, why, we'd come home.
When they got the call, it was just like everything else. It's, do what the government calls you to do.
Frank Daly from Summit, Utah, asked some World War II vets he knew if they would help lead the unit. The battalion leadership consisted of Colonel Frank Daly as battalion commander, Major Patrick Fenton as executive officer or second in command, and Frank's brother, Major Max Daly, as operations officer or third in command. With the leadership in place, a sense of deep responsibility grew over Colonel Daly.
Of course, I know Frank really felt that. Here he had about 600 men from southern Utah. If he didn't bring most of them home, he might as well have moved into California someplace.
Frank Daly and the other leaders became father figures for many of the young men.
I, as one, was very young. I was only 18 years old, and I had 85 fathers that were on my neck every day.
The activation hit southern Utah harder even than World War II. Virtually every family was affected. The immediate impact was powerful enough, but the potential loss of 500 local men in combat would have been devastating. Dally was keenly aware that his unit included not only co-workers and friends, but brothers, cousins, uncles, and nephews. Even with the risk, families and communities rallied in support.
To have 52 young men out of a community the size of Beaver or these other communities was really a shocking time for these people, because, you know, it brought probably the community closer together than they'd been for a long time.
In late August, the unit gathered at the train station in Delta, Utah.
From there we went to Fort Lewis, Washington, where we was put under really rapid training. Now, we didn't have basic training, so to speak, but we went in and really did the firing with our M7 105 howitzers.
The men honed their artillery skills and received additional soldiers from the regular Army and reserves to fill their numbers to full fighting strength. By late fall, when the 213th was fully trained and outfitted, 16 UN member nations had entered the war and joined the battlefront in support of South Korea. Additional countries sent medical teams. On the communist side, China and the Soviet Union supported North Korea. Altogether, over 25 countries were involved in the war in the embattled Korean landscape. The Korean conflict was the most visible manifestation of the Cold War. The Korean Peninsula simply the stage where the international conflict played out. And now southern Utahns found themselves in the middle of that global conflict. The unit departed Seattle, Washington on January 26, 1951, aboard the military transport ship General Meigs. They sailed to San Francisco and beyond.
They didn't expect that we'd actually leave the United States because there were the active duty personnel full-time thinking that they would go and we'd replace them.
As if leaving the United States wasn't bad enough, some of the landlubber Utahns had a difficult first experience with the open sea.
None of us ever been on the ocean, really. Not many of us, anyway. So it was tough. A lot of us were seasick.
But I'd been seasick enough that I didn't care if they shot me when I got off the ship, as long as I was able to get my feet on steady ground again.
Others with more seagoing experience took advantage of the situation.
Because I used to chuckle about that, because each meal there'd be less and less officers there, so I had more and more desserts that I could eat.
To reduce the stress or monotony of the trip, the men received a certificate when they crossed the international date line, a milestone or omen for some of these Utah boys. Even aboard the ship, the men still didn't really know where they were headed.
When we got on the ship, we thought, well, we'll go down to San Francisco and then we'll go through the Panama Canal and we'll go over to Germany and replace the regular army. But when we headed west from San Francisco, we thought, that's not where we're going.
The intense work and award-winning artillery shooting during training at Fort Lewis earmarked them for Korea.
And we had done too good a job, and the unit was rated too high to leave sitting. So we went to Korea.
After a stop in Yokohama, Japan, the unit landed in Busan, Korea on February 16, 1951. The country was ravaged by war, and it was a true culture shock for some.
As when we pulled into the harbor of Busan, was looking from the ship and seeing a Korean woman walk down the street and merely pull up her dress and use the bathroom right in front of all of us.
We'd cover our garbage and all of our stuff with dirt. And before we moved out, here would come the Koreans with shovels and pans to dig into our garbage to see what they could get to eat.
The Koreans were suffering, but life for those back in Utah was not easy either. It was tough on mothers, sisters, and wives.
I do remember, well, going to, places with her and feeling that, emptiness that my dad wasn't there. And so I'm sure she was very lonely.
We knew nothing of really where they were going or how long they would be gone or if we would ever see them again.
We knew when we were in danger, and then there'd be a lull in the fighting. And we'd go back, maybe get to see a movie, maybe get to read a book, maybe get to play cards or just shoot the bull. But as far as my wife was concerned, people were shooting at me every hour of every day. And it was really harder on her and really harder on mothers and sweethearts than maybe it was on us.
Fortunately, the men had a lot of support within the unit.
I was with 2 brothers. I had a couple of first cousins with me, and the kids of the guys that I run around with. Some of them practically all my life. Guys that I went to school with. And so it was really, there wasn't a strong homesick feeling like you probably would have with a lot of other units, you know.
The men also remembered home by flying a Utah state flag sent by the Cedar City Elks Lodge. That flag was soon flying during intense battles. After about a month of additional training and stockpiling of supplies, Baker Company fired the battalion's first rounds in combat. The unit moved northeast of Seoul, near Kapyong, an important road and rail location just south of the 38th parallel. As the battlefront got closer, Colonel Daly sought additional guidance for his men.
Every single day, he'd put a white flag out on front of his tent. And when that white flag was out there, nobody disturbed him. He was communicating with his commander-in-chief of all the armies. He was in prayer.
In the spring of 1951, the Chinese launched a major offensive. Repeated advances and withdrawals moved the front lines back and forth across the valleys and along the 38th parallel. The 213th shot powerful exploding ammunition from their howitzers into enemy targets miles away. Each firing battery had 6 howitzers. Their job was to support friendly ground troops, and these artillerymen proved their skill time after time.
We could put around 3 miles and put it through the door of a bunker. Or 5 miles, we could hit the door of a bunker pretty good.
Not only did they shoot accurately, they were fast.
We shot over $1 million worth of ammunition in one day up there.
They were the Utah National Guard fighting behind the front lines supporting infantry. Together, the 5 batteries could position their howitzers and carefully calculate how 18 guns could hit the same or different targets simultaneously or at precisely timed increments. Fuses could be adjusted to explode on impact or in the air. Often, the guns would fire through the night. But quite a few close calls kept the battalion on its toes.
I jumped up and stood by a tree that was bigger than the doors, than a house door, wider. And somebody with a burp gun just shot the bark all off that tree. Never hit me.
Repeated advances and withdrawals kept the 213th sharp. In an interview after the war, Daly described how in April 1951, his unit was surrounded by enemy troops.
In almost superhuman time, the battalion was assembled and headed for the temporary safety of friendly lines. Over 12 to 15 miles of rough, steep canyon road, and for about 9 grueling hours, a prayer remained in my heart.
Frank was very careful where he put his units, and he always put them where he had a way out. Now, lots of units like ours were annihilated. And I can't help but think that a good deal of it was because they didn't take care of themselves.
We would get to some place that an outfit would have been wiped out, and we'd get there 2 hours later and the Chinese had gone, or we would leave and they would come after.
That practice of watching out for themselves would pay off just 1 month later. On May 26, 1951, the 213th found itself in a narrow canyon. Several miles separated the batteries. Service, Baker, and Charlie batteries continued to pound the enemy from locations down the canyon. Headquarters and Able Battery were at the top of the canyon, along with other nearby UN units. Colonel Daly had sent out his patrols.
The infantry does that all the time, but artillerymen, it was new to them. But because of that, this night in Kapyong, he sent out some patrols. And they came back and said, there's a lot of action out here. And so the word went out, nobody sleeps tonight. I remember that particular order.
In a post-war interview for a national audience with famous broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, Frank Daly described the situation.
The Republic of Korea forces we were supporting at that time fell back without warning us, making it possible for the communist forces to practically surround us without being detected. For moments, I suppose, I was almost dazed. Then instinctively my thoughts turned to God, and I knew that our safety was in the hands of our Maker. I humbly asked for help, as I know and felt that many of the others did who were near me, for I feel sure that I was guided by a supreme being. It became clear to me the course that we must follow, and all the men calmly responded to a rapid series of instructions.
I was just going on guard duty, 5 minutes to 2, and all hell broke loose. If you ever seen fireworks, it was there that night. We stood there while that company of infantry, just a couple of 100 yards away, was wiped out in just a few minutes.
With no infantry protection, 240 Utahns came face to face with 4,000 enemy Chinese soldiers.
Seemed like everywhere you looked, there was somebody dug in a hole or hiding behind a bush or something like that.
And ours was the weakest area to try to get through. So, but they found out that those little Southern Utah Guardsmen stemmed the tide.
The men fired their small arms.
We'd holler, get down in English, and if they didn't get down, then we figured they didn't understand English, and we'd shoot.
The men fired their howitzers.
One of those shells would go off and blow a hole in them, 50 yards wide, 100 yards long. And the only trouble you had was getting another shell out there before the hole filled up.
The enemy kept coming.
You could look any direction. It don't matter which way you looked, and there were Chinese. We were totally surrounded.
Other nearby friendly units were wiped out.
We went in up the canyon. First thing I noticed was 5 dead Americans. That was from the 21st Infantry Medic Company.
In another part of the canyon, Wesley Chadburn manned a machine gun.
I would say there was probably close to 100 killed.
Paul Grimshaw was on the radio phone with one of the lookouts who had his M1 ready.
And this young man opened up, I heard him shoot the full clip, and the clip went ping, and I heard another clip go in, and he started shooting again, and he shot that one clear up. And I've never found out for sure how many people he killed there, but he killed several, and it was turned out that they were the division officers.
Perhaps the loss of many of their officers confused the enemy. The Utahns fired directly at the charging enemy. Fuses were set to a half second, exploding shrapnel directly over the enemy's heads. As dawn broke, the battle abated, and in a temporary lull, able battery commander Captain Ray Cox organized a combat patrol. With 18 men, 1 howitzer, and 3 machine guns, they attacked the Chinese.
9 on each side of that half-track, or that tank, went right up through that canyon, killing like you can't imagine. We'd come out into a little valley, and here would be Chinese just by the hundreds. Well, I thought this is where I meet my Maker. And instead of them firing one single round, they started to lay their guns down and raise their hands. There was 98 of them in that little valley. Me and another man brought those 98 back out to headquarters.
And for Captain Cox to take this thing on and take it up there and then be so successful, just almost like a miracle.
There was no one that made that battle except Captain Cox and his initiative to take the howitzer and a few men on foot and go up through the draw.
Some Utahns were injured.
If you ever seen a burp gun, it's the fastest little weapon you've ever seen in your life. And he was sprayed from his right hip to his left shoulder, and he walked out. The Chinese prisoners that we took that could speak English, they said, we shoot them, but they don't fall.
These bitter engagements continued for several hours until the enemy withdrew. The retreating Chinese attempted to climb the steep surrounding mountain slopes under an intense artillery barrage. That devastating fire convinced the enemy that escape was impossible, and they turned back in massive surrender.
It was direct fire, and that's what kind of broke their will.
With the roar of the guns stilled, the artillerymen returned to count the cost. Hundreds of soldiers lay limp and dead, but not one was from the Utah National Guard. Nearly 500 Chinese died in that night-to-morning battle. With over 800 Chinese prisoners of war, the commanders put their men to work.
Men that were there frisking these guys to be sure they didn't have any weapons on them. They came in with their hands up to stack their arms, and they just had a big pile of them up in the valley, several truckloads.
I went up there and helped disarm a lot of the prisoners and form them up in columns so they could go on down the mountain.
Before rejoining their infantry, the citizen soldiers performed a humanitarian act that set them apart as sensitive caring men. They paused long enough to bury the enemy dead.
I kept 50 Chinese to dig graves. We were digging the graves to put them in the rocky bed of this canyon, and I tell you, it was a job. And those Chinamen would just pick up their buddies and throw them in.
And there was a lot of dead Chinese. I mean, my gosh, they had a trench dug there that was 50 feet long. They was throwing bodies in.
Soldiers don't go through a night like that without changing.
Went over as boys and came back as men. And
the Utahns continued to fight, and by October and November, most of the original members were rotating home.
Lovely to be back home with your family and all your friends and loved ones.
I got on the telephone and called home and said, does anybody want to give a lonely soldier a ride home? I could hear Mother screaming in the background.
We were very glad that they were home. I wouldn't want to go through it again.
On January 25, 1952, General Willard Wyman stood before the few remaining original members of Able Battery and Headquarters Battery and the replacements of those who had rotated home to award the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation tells the story of the Kapyong battle and praises the men's unshakable determination and gallantry. It says they accomplished their mission under extremely difficult and hazardous conditions as to set them apart and above other units participating in the action. The extraordinary heroism displayed by members of these units reflects great credit on themselves and upholds the highest traditions of the military service of the United States. Not only did these soldiers of the 213th uphold the highest traditions of the military service, they upheld the highest traditions of their families, their communities, and their religion.
They were well prepared, and they were morally straight. They were good men.
Most of the men were raised as Latter-day Saints and believed the story from the Book of Mormon, where a group of warriors survived incredible odds because of their faith, the faith of their families, and inspired leaders.
Helaman and his 1,000 stripling young warriors. I think there's a parallel there. That was a scenario that actually it did happen.
The 213th has a true distinction, returning with all its men. There were other costs, however. Some of the men returned sick, especially Colonel Daly.
When he went into Korea, he weighed about 180 pounds, brown hair. When he came out, he weighed about 140 pounds and white hair.
They say they all came back because of the strong spiritual support from home.
We prayed for these people in our I think our prayers were answered.
I'm convinced that the faith and prayers of our parents and loved ones is what protected us.
They say they all came back because of strong leaders.
You know, to go 600 men go and 600 men come back, you've got to have some good leadership.
Colonel Dally watched, everyone was his son. He watched everybody like they were his own child. We had a lot of incoming rounds. We got our butts kicked, excuse the word. But we did time after time but Colonel Dally saved us all.
They say they all came back because they worked together.
Professionalism. These men were prepared. They took care of each other. They looked out for each other.
They say they all came back because they believed.
Not praying for the Lord to be on our side, but that we were on His side and doing what was right.
On July 27, 1953, number 1 gun in Baker Battery fired the 213th's last round in Korea. Later that night, at 2200 hours, the peace agreement took effect. Shell fragments lay all along the 38th parallel that remained the dividing line between North and South Korea. The men returned from Korea to a largely indifferent nation from an unofficial war. Many kept their experiences to themselves and spoke only in general terms. The short, brutal Korean War may always be overshadowed by other wars and may even be considered forgotten through a feeling of indifference. But for these men, there was no indifference and no forgetting. Their service, their friendship, and their faith brought about the miracle at Kapyong.